For this lab, we're going to be creating a image processor, whereby, let's say there's a scenario where we need to create a function that's going to be automatically grayscaling our images. So the idea is that we will be able to upload an image of color like this, and it will automatically be converted into grayscale. Now, this is just to highlight the functionality of serverless computing when it comes to cloud. So the exercise itself, what it calls for is that we're going to be creating an, uh, an S3 and Lambda integration with image processing. Right. So the objective for this is that we're going to be creating two S3 buckets, one to store the original image and one to store a processed image. We're going to write Python code to process the image into grayscale using AWS Lambda. So essentially, we're going to be using serverless functionality. And we're going to be doing some troubleshooting some errors, and then we're going to be testing the function, and we're just going to be fully testing the workflow so that we get this, whereby we upload one image and then we get the grayscale equivalent on the other side. Here's another example that was done as well. So here we upload one image and we get the grayscale automatically converted to the other. So the idea of this is to be able to use the cloud so that we can automate repetitive functions. So imagine someone's job is to just grayscale images. Granted, you could of course use any tool you want, like Photoshop or Inkscape or um, even the default photo editor for Windows, and you can manually edit a picture into grayscale. But what if you're getting thousands of them? And what if you want to do it automatically? So with this demo, we're just going to highlight the importance of this idea of serverless, which is the idea of not having to handle the server itself. So for example, when we go into Amazon Web Services, we have something known as the Lambda functions. And the Lambda functions essentially allow us to be able to utilize AWS services without having to worry about the server itself. And what I mean by that is that we can go in and just focus on code specifically. And so in this process, I don't have to set up the operating system. I don't have to worry about the data necessarily. I don't have to specify any configurations. I can just go in and set up what I want for my function to be able to be executed. So just for example, if I'm creating a new one, right, you can notice that I can choose whatever runtime I want. I can have Python, I can have Node, I can have Java, you can use .NET, I can use Ruby. And as long as I have my code executed, I can even select whatever architecture I want in the background. But I can in this way I can just focus on my code to just be released. So bringing it back to the lab itself, the way we're going to do this is one, we're going to create an S3 bucket, specifically two S3 buckets. And the S3 buckets we're going to be creating are going to be one that's going to be called demo-student source bucket. Now, when I say demo, all right, specifically in the instructions, okay, what I want you to do is to be able to create a bucket that says student source bucket and then your first name. So for example, what we're going to do here is we're going to go to our buckets, all right? And you can see, you'll be able to see everyone else's buckets here in previous buckets. But what we're going to want to do is we're going to make our own buckets. So let's first make sure that we're operating in US East North Virginia. You might run into some errors if you're in the wrong region for this lab. And then we're going to create our bucket. So here, I'm just going to put my name as just Gabe. And let's see, what does the lab call for? I'll actually put these side by side so it's easier to manage. Gabe dash student source bucket. Now I don't need to modify anything with my bucket. It'd be a good idea to just enable some versioning. But other than that, I can just leave everything as the default. No need to make any other changes. I just want to make sure, and you will run into some issues if you don't follow the naming convention of the bucket. This has to do with the policies that are in place for this lab. So make sure it's your first name, and honestly, you can put whatever you want before that, but you just have to make sure that you follow this later part, which is the dash student dash source dash bucket configuration. Once you have that, you can go ahead and create your bucket. You will notice that you're going to get a couple of errors that come into place. Not to worry about that. As long as you get this green bar up at the top that says successfully created your bucket, And sure enough, if you go into view details, you'll be able to see that, hey, you have your bucket in place. Nice. So that is going to be your source bucket. Now let's go back to the buckets and let's go ahead and create our destination bucket. So same as last time, we have to follow the naming convention, dash student destination bucket. And in this time, I'm just going to put my first name again. And notice this one is the destination bucket. No other changes. If I want to, I can enable enabling. I'm just going to keep this bucket structure very, very simple. And again, you're going to probably run into some errors because you don't have full permissions for everything here. But as long as you get this and you can view the details, you'll be able to see that you have your buckets. Fantastic. Our buckets are created. We'll come back to them in a bit. Now what we want to do is we're going to want to go ahead and create our Lambda function. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and create a Lambda function that's going to be, again, my first name, dash, and I need to follow the naming convention here, student image processor. Make sure you don't have two dashes in there. Gabe student image processor. Here for my runtime, I'm going to be selecting Python 3.10, 3.10. And you can leave the architecture as x86-64, that's fine. And now we need to go into our default execution rules. So when it comes to Amazon Web Services, specifically with Lambda functions here, we will need to have permissions to be able to access our buckets from our serverless function in Lambda. Usually, when you create a function, this can be created for you automatically. However, we already have one in place that's created for us. So use the Lambda role student lab, and you're going to create your function. Great. So now we have our Lambda function in place, and there's going to be a couple of changes that we have to make. So first of all, you can see we have our Lambda function py, and we can go ahead and copy the source code here. Oops, there we go. Oh, it's a little hard to get it from a PDF. Let's see if we can improve that. Copy and paste functionality. There we go. Copy that. Paste that in there. Oh, didn't seem to get everything. So let's go ahead and fix this piece by piece. We'll just get it in chunks. So we're gonna get our first set of code there. And there we go. So now we have our full Lambda function in place. All right. Yes. So the next thing we have to do is we're then going to click deploy right here, or you can press Control Shift U. It'll be updating the function. And there we go. Now we have our code in place. We have our function in place. And let's go ahead and try to test this. So what we can do is here in the test environment, you'll notice that we can create a new event and we'll just call it my first test if we want. But we have to establish a event JSON format. So you can see here, here's some default values, and we're going to change this with what we need in order to be able to test our function properly. So we're going to use the provided test function here. And now, important thing to note, notice how this is going for the demo. I'm going to want to change it to what I originally have, which is my Gabe bucket. So here's my test function. I'm going to save this, and I'm going to test. Now, I'm expecting an error, and I'm going to explain why. A couple of things happen. First of all, it's important that when we're testing code, especially in serverless functions, we know how to debug things, because it's most likely when we do something, especially when it's very complicated, this is a very straightforward task, but when serverless functions get a little bit more complex than what we're doing in this lab, it's very important for us to know how we can troubleshoot this and debug this. I can immediately tell you that we actually have an error in our code already. And that first error is that we're trying to reach a bucket called first name student destination bucket, which does not exist. Remember, we had to call this our specific bucket here based on our first name. So I actually need to run this, okay, with the correct bucket name, as well as the test. And essentially the way this Python code is working is that we're going to be using Pillow, which is going to be a package that's going to allow us to be able to convert the color image into grayscale. And here we're specifying what bucket we want to grab from, and it's going to be the source bucket, which we're going to be assigning. I mentioned we're going to go back to the events, or we're going to go to the notifications tab in the source bucket in just a moment and modify that. But then we're also establishing where we're going to be sending it, right? Now, when we're doing our test, we ran into an issue here. And the issue that we're having is that inherently the serverless function does not have the package that we need, all right? It's expecting a specific function, but it's not actually going to be able to execute that. So in fact, if I were to run this again, let's run this test, we're going to get an error again, all right? And here is that it's expecting, well, first of all, there's a syntax error in our code, right? But even if we were to fix that error, we're going to run into another issue anyways, which is that the pillow package is not inherently imported into our Lambda function. So this is where we need to be a little bit more creative in solving this. And this is where the flexibility of serverless comes in hand, because what we can do is we can actually create a zip file with the package that we need. In fact, I already have this in place here. I'm going to modify this to be exactly what I need. So I'm just going to go here. I'm going to modify my lambda function.py. All right. And here is essentially the same code that I have that I've posted in here, except again, I don't want to have it as demo. I want to have it be my first name. I'm going to go ahead and save that. Oops, don't want to purchase that. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create if you look here in my packages, I already have the pillow folder here, but I'll just recreate it again. So I'm going to create a zip file that's going to have all my packages in one place, all right? And I actually did skip a step here. In fact, in order to get to this point, I had to go ahead and install pillow and pip. So if you don't have it already, make sure you install sudo apt install python 3 dash pip, and make sure you do a pip install pillow. Right. In fact, I already had these installed in place, so nothing left for me to do other than create my zip file. And so in this case, I'm going to go ahead and zip my file. Actually, I should, before I do that, I should actually remove the existing one that I have so I can recreate this. All right, so now it's compiling everything, compressing into a zip file, and now I have my zip folder. Whoops, let's get rid of the caps lock. I have my zip folder there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to upload my zip file. And notice that there is a requirement here. It has to be below 10 megabytes. You can upload over 10 megabytes, but it's preferred if you use an S3 bucket for that. But in fact, you'll see it's 4.8, so it's actually smaller than the expected one. Important thing to note is that once I upload this, all right, it will overwrite my existing code. We'll see that in just a moment. Can take a couple seconds, but essentially what it's doing now is that it's going to be grabbing my zip file, and then after that it's going to be expanding the zip and getting all the files that I need. And now you'll notice that when I go into my code here, as it's loading, and by the way, this part's in the instructions as well, package the uploaded dependencies, test the Lambda function, all right, and then test the workflow. Now you'll notice that my dependencies are on there. So now it's actually specifically getting exactly what I need, and it's there. So here I'm getting not just my Python code, but also my pillow package as well too. Now I can go ahead and run this test again, and in fact, I'm still going to get an error, all right, for a couple of reasons, and we're going to be fixing this, all right? Essentially, I need to make sure that my Lambda function has the proper handler. So one thing that I want to make sure actually when I go down here is I want to make sure that this is set to lambda underscore function lambda handler. So this looks good. The other thing I'm going to want to change to in my configurations tab is the timeout. Now because we're dealing with image processing, it can take a little bit longer. So I'm actually just going to increase this to 2 minutes, and I'm going to save that. The other thing too is that when we're doing this test, specifically when we're running this test, it's expecting the Gabe student source bucket to have a file called test image. So let's go ahead and make sure we have that. The other thing we want to do too is we need to establish a notification as well for our S3 bucket. So let's go ahead and set that up in our source bucket. What we're going to want to do is go into our buckets, make sure we go into the, let's refresh this actually, get our new buckets in place. There we go. So you see I have Gabe student destination bucket, Gabe student source bucket. So let's go ahead go into our source bucket, and we're going to be doing two things first. The first thing we're going to want to do is upload a test image so that we can use our test file. So I already have a test image here that I've made, and by the way, you can get images from a free downloadable JPEG image library. So in this case, I forgot what I'm using here. I think this is FreePic. So we're going to upload our test image first. So that way we have our test image, because when we're doing our test from our Lambda functions, it's expecting to find something like this within this bucket if we want to have a successful test. All right, which it doesn't have. So now it has that, so we're good there. And the other thing we're going to want to do as well too is we're going to want to update and create a notification. And what this is going to do is essentially when we upload an image, or when there's an image here, the Lambda function is going to kick in. So here we're going to want to go into our properties, and we're going to want to modify an event notification, and here we're going to create an event notification. Now, the event name can be whatever we like. Here I'm just going to call it the image uploader trigger. I'm not going to be making any modifications here. However, on the object creation, I'm going to want to have it identified as all object create events put. So whenever something gets placed into this folder, it's going to trigger a Lambda function, specifically the Lambda function that I created for myself, which is Gabe's student image processor. Now you'll see other people's or other students' Lambda functions. If you select theirs, it's not going to work, because remember, our Lambda functions is specifically programmed for our folder. So here I'm going to select the Gabe student image processor, and I'm going to save that. All right. Again, you might see some errors here saying that you don't have access to this. That's fine, but you can see here at the top, successfully created event notification image upload trigger. So now I should be able to go here and be able to run my test again. And when I run this, you see that the seconds are counting up, and it's being processed right now. And we finally got a successful image. And if we look at the details here, you can see status code 200, body process test image successfully. So now if we go into our destination bucket, there's our grayscale image from our test image. Now let's put this into action, and let's actually see if it's fully working. What we can do is let's go to our free pics here, and let's find a nice picture here. This owl looks pretty cool. And we're going to go ahead and download that. Free download. Now it doesn't matter what it's called, all right? Because what we did up to this point, let's just recap what we've done. We created a bucket, two buckets, source bucket and a destination bucket. Then we created our serverless function. We ensured that we have a way to be able to test our bucket, or excuse me, our function, to make sure that it works. But not just that, we first created our Python code. We then modified our Python code in I use Sublime Text, but you can use whatever you want, and created a folder with all the dependencies that we need, because remember, the server itself will not inherently install the packages for us. We need to do that ourselves. So that's why we created the zip folder. We added this. We have a way to test this. We validated the test. So now we know that it's going to work when we upload this. So here, let's go into our source bucket. Oops, I'm going to look for Gabe's source bucket. You can see I have my test image there, but I'm going to go ahead and upload that very cool owl image that we have downloaded. Owl, bird, colorful flowers. Let's do that. So we're going to add files. We're going to go to our downloads. Where's the owl bird? Open. All right, it uploads it. We're going to do upload. So right now it's uploading the file into our source bucket. And now, again, could take a couple of seconds. I'm just going to keep refreshing this. And well, let's first make sure that this is done. So right now, this is done. We've uploaded our bird image. So if we close this, we can see in our source bucket, we have two images. All right, we had our test image, which we used, and then we had the owl bird colorful image. Now, if we go into our destination one, just give it a couple seconds. We're going to keep refreshing this. Remember, depending on the size of the image, it's pretty large. It can take a while to process. I give it a minute or two, and then we should be seeing our owl image here. Well, let's see. I guess it's not liking. Let's see what happened. Oh, well, there we go. Size is very likely a reason why. Something to note here with the Lambda functions, you are limited with size. You usually start with 128. You can increase this, as I say, up to 1040. I'm just going to leave this at the default of 128. And so let's go ahead and actually do this again and try it with something a little bit smaller. So let's do an upload and let's add a file. Let's try the parakeet. This one's only 13. Let's go ahead and add that. Upload. You can see it's actually uploading a little bit faster than the owl one before. And that's one thing to note. Again, like this is just a demo that we're putting together here. The reality is that you would test this and you would verify it. It works for all various shapes and sizes. But usually if it's a larger file size, you will run into errors. The other thing too is remember we increase the timeout as well too, because if it takes longer than 2 minutes and 3 seconds, then it's just going to fail. And one thing actually, now that we're talking about troubleshooting here, that we can go over as well is monitoring our Lambda functions. So we can actually see how they get executed over time in the past 3 hours. So here I can go in the past hour and I can see, and sure enough, let me see if I can find, yep, there we go. We got one error there. It's probably when the owl function was being, or the owl image was trying to be processed there, or when we were doing the tests. But you can actually see the invocations, the duration, the error count, and success rate for when you actually execute the Lambda function. This is very helpful as well too, so that you know if it's actually running or not. So let's go back and take a look at our destination. Yeah, clearly the size does matter, and that was an issue there. It's if it was over 20, we ran into some errors there. So if I were to spend more time on this, I think I would most likely update the configuration so that we can increase the timeout. We would also increase the memory. But for now, if you go with something lower than 20 MB, you'll have no problem. And here's our grayscale parakeet. And I already have this one downloaded before, and so we can just open this up and there's our grayscale. So anyways, that's the lab. Go ahead and have fun with it. Again, just some minor details and notes just to overview. Remember, you are doing this with two different buckets, your destination bucket and your source bucket. The other thing too is remember to complete the configuration test just to make sure it's working. You can always, of course, have the monitoring. When you're doing a configuration, you're more than welcome to increase the memory. You can definitely increase, because we're doing some image processing, you're going to want to increase the timeout as well too. And for the code component, don't forget that you have to do a zip file and upload this. And then have fun with it and upload whatever images you want. And by the end of it, you should have something that will allow you to go to your source bucket, get an image. So let's try this one more time and let's see if we can get something a little bit smaller. Let's go with this swan. Download the free version of that. Oh, I reached a limit. Never mind. I guess no more pictures. But get something that's smaller scale and under 20. Upload it. Remember when you're doing your test, so pay attention to the names of your images, specifically when you're doing the tests. Focus on and make sure you're changing the names of your folders as well too, of your S3 buckets, and you should be able to have something functioning by the end of this. All right, and if you have any questions, of course, send me an email.